The CEO had heard it all week. Every luxury dealership in the city had looked at her car, shrugged their shoulders, and handed back the keys with the same tired verdict. Just buy a new one. Mechanics with certified patches on their sleeves, service managers in pressed shirts, consultants who charged $400 an hour to tell her nothing. They all delivered the same conclusion, without hesitation, without remorse, and without ever truly looking. But there was one person who hadn't said that yet. One person who hadn't even opened his mouth when she walked through the door of his rusted little garage on the edge of town. And when he finally did speak, when he finally lifted the hood and pressed 2 fingers against the engine block and went very, very still the entire direction of her week, her company, and her life began to shift in ways she could not yet understand. Her name was Victoria Harmon, 41 years old, Chief Executive Officer of Harmon Realty and Capital, a firm she had built from a single leased office in downtown Chicago into one of the most aggressive commercial real estate companies in the Midwest. She wore charcoal gray like a second skin. She did not raise her voice in meetings because she never needed to. 12 years ago, she had been the youngest managing partner at a rival firm. 8 years ago, she had walked away and built her own. People who underestimated her once rarely had the opportunity to do it twice. She had a reputation in the industry for what her competitors called ruthlessness and what her colleagues called precision. The ability to identify exactly what a situation required and deliver it without sentiment, without excess, without the kind of hesitation that costs leverage. The skill had served her extraordinarily well. It had also, over the years, made certain kinds of connection difficult. The people in her life who knew her well enough to say what they actually thought could be counted on one hand. By the standards of the world she operated in, Victoria Harmon had arrived, and she had arrived entirely on her own terms. The only thing she had never been able to replace, had never wanted to replace, was the car. It was a 1968 Mercedes-Benz 280 SE sedan, midnight blue with a cream leather interior, kept in better condition than most cars a decade younger. Her father, Raymond Harmon, had bought it second-hand in the mid-1980s, had spent 7 years restoring it bolt by bolt in the garage of a rented house in Evanston while working double shifts at a warehouse. He had called it his proof of concept, proof that something broken could be returned to its original dignity if you were patient enough, skilled enough, and stubborn enough not to quit. He had given the car to Victoria on the day she launched Harmon Realty and Capital. He had died 14 months later. She had driven it to his funeral. She had driven it to every Gyri major closing since. She had driven it to the first board meeting, to the opening of the second office, and to the press announcement of their largest deal to date. It had been present at every significant moment of the professional life that her father had believed in before she had fully believed in it herself. The car was not a vehicle. The car was a covenant. So when it died on a Tuesday morning in the parking structure beneath her office building engine, cutting out with a low, unfamiliar groan, dashboard flickering twice before going dark, Victoria did not call a tow truck and move on with her day. She sat in the silence of the car for nearly 2 minutes, hands on the wheel, and felt something close to dread move through her chest. This was the worst possible week. She had a gala on Friday evening, where she was expected to sign a $230 million joint venture agreement with Meridian Group, one of the largest commercial developers in the country. She had board members flying in. She had press. She had, as her assistant Marcus had put it that morning in a tone of barely concealed panic, absolutely no margin for disruption. And now this. She had the car towed to the first dealership by noon. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, she had visited 3. The first was a Mercedes-Benz flagship on Michigan Avenue, all glass and indirect lighting and salesmen, who wore their watches like credentials. A senior technician spent 11 minutes with the car, before emerging to tell her that the repair would require sourcing parts that were, quote, functionally obsolete. He recommended she consider the current S-Class lineup, which he said with a smile that suggested he considered the conversation already closed. The second dealership, a specialty European auto group in Lincoln Park, was more apologetic, but no more useful. Their diagnosis was longer, and their vocabulary was more technical. but the conclusion was identical. The repair costs would exceed the vehicle's market value, and restoration to full reliability was not something they could guarantee. They had a brochure ready, she noticed. It was sitting on the service desk before she had finished explaining the problem, as though the conclusion had been decided before the question was asked. The third was the worst. A consultant there, young, confident, clearly more interested in his commission than her problem, actually laughed when she mentioned wanting to keep the car. Not a full laugh, a small, dismissive exhale through the nose, the kind that said he thought she was being sentimental in a way that was professionally inconvenient for everyone involved. He then spent 20 minutes walking her through a showroom of vehicles starting at $110,000. Each one gleaming and interchangeable, and utterly meaningless to her. Victoria left the third dealership at 6:15 that evening. She sat in the back of a hired car, with the kind of controlled fury she had learned, over many years, to keep entirely internal. She was not going to buy a new car. That was not a decision she was making out of stubbornness or grief, though both were present. She was making it because the car was fixable, and she was certain of this the way she was certain of most things based on evidence rather than emotion. The problem was that no one she had encountered that day seemed to actually want to fix anything. They wanted to sell, and the vintage Mercedes sitting in the first dealership service bay was, to all of them, simply an obstacle between her and a transaction. It was Marcus who mentioned the garage. He said it carefully, the way he always delivered information he wasn't sure she would receive well, with a slight pause before the sentence and a slight flattening of his affect during it. He said he had heard about a place on the west side, near the industrial corridor off Kedzie, run by a single mechanic, who apparently still worked on older European models. He said he couldn't find much information about it online. He said the guy's name was Daniel Storley. He said, and here Marcus paused again, that Daniel had a reputation among a certain kind of car person as someone who could find things other mechanics missed. Victoria told him to have the car transferred there by 8 the following morning. The garage was called Hartley Automotive. The sign was hand-painted. The building was a converted single-bay auto shop from what appeared to be the 1950s. Its original cinderblock exterior now painted a fading gray-green that had probably looked intentional at some point, and now simply looked weathered. There was no customer waiting area. There were 2 folding chairs against one wall, a card table with a coffee maker, and a pegboard of tools that covered the entire back wall, with the kind of organized density that suggested someone had thought very hard about where each thing belonged. The fluorescent light overhead hummed. The floor was stained with 50 years of oil but swept clean. It smelled like metal and solvent, and something faintly like cedar, which Victoria could not immediately explain. Daniel Hartley was 43 years old. He was medium height, lean in the way of someone who stayed active without trying, with dark hair going gray at the temples and hands that told the story of his profession without requiring any words. He was wearing dark work pants and a gray thermal shirt with a small grease mark on the left sleeve. He did not come to meet her when she arrived. He was already under the hood of another vehicle, a 1972 Jaguar E-Type, and he finished what he was doing before he wiped his hands on a clean rag and walked over. He did not shake her hand immediately. He looked at the Mercedes first. He walked around it once, slowly, not touching it. Then he crouched beside the front passenger wheel well for a moment, looking at something she couldn't see. Then he stood, and then he looked at her. "Who told you to replace this car?" he asked. "Everyone," she said. He nodded once, as if this confirmed something he had already assumed. "How long have you had it?" "It was my father's before mine." "Roughly 40 years in the family." He looked back at the car. "When did it die?" "Yesterday morning." "Engine cut out." No warning lights before the moment it happened, which struck me as unusual. He was already moving toward the hood release. "That's not unusual for a fault that was introduced rather than developed," he said, almost to himself, and she wasn't entirely sure she had heard him correctly until he had the hood up and his attention had shifted entirely to what was beneath it. She almost left. That was the truth of it, and later she would think about that moment with a particular kind of gratitude. How close she had come to turning around, deciding this was too much, that the detour to a half-empty garage in an industrial neighborhood was a luxury she didn't have in a week this critical. The folding chairs, the humming light, the hand-painted sign, every instinct calibrated by years in the world of glass towers and tailored suits was telling her that nothing here could solve her problem. But she stayed, partly because the car was already inside, and she didn't have an immediate alternative, and partly because of the way he had said that word introduced. Like he was already thinking about something the other mechanics hadn't thought to think about at all. She watched him work for nearly 4 minutes in silence. He did not use a diagnostic computer first, which was the first thing every technician at the dealerships had reached for. Instead, he worked with his hands and, at one point, pressed his ear briefly to the edge of the engine block in a gesture so matter-of-fact it seemed almost old-fashioned. He traced wiring with his fingertips. He removed a panel she hadn't seen anyone else remove. He went still, then he went very still, and then he straightened up, turned to look at her, and said, "Come here. I need you to see this." She came to the car and leaned in beside him. He pointed to a component deep in the engine bay, a small module she didn't recognize, roughly the size of a deck of cards, attached to a bracket near the fuel injection system. It looked, at first glance, like a standard part, but he pointed to its edges, and she saw it, a series of fine marks, barely visible, the kind left by a tool used to remove and reinstall something with precision. And then he pointed to the connector on its underside, and she saw a second thing. One of the pins was bent at an angle that was not factory, not accidental wear, not anything that happened on its own over time. This was done deliberately, he said. Someone accessed this module and altered it. It would have run fine for a while, maybe weeks before the interference caused the engine management system to fail. It's designed to look like age-related degradation. He paused. This isn't a mechanical failure. This is sabotage. Victoria Harmon did not say anything for a long moment. She was a woman who had trained herself to process information before reacting to it, who had sat across from adversaries in negotiating rooms and boardrooms and courtrooms, and kept her face as neutral as paper. But standing in a drafty single-bay garage on a Wednesday morning with a mechanic she had met 12 minutes ago, she felt something move through her that she hadn't felt in a very long time. It was not anger, exactly. It was the cold, specific sensation of understanding that the threat was closer than she had thought, that it was not external, not a market downturn, not a competitor's maneuver, not bad luck. Someone had put their hands on her father's car. Someone had planned this. "Who benefits if you fail this week?" Daniel asked. She looked up from the engine. He wasn't being dramatic. The question was practical, delivered with the same flat directness as everything else he had said. She thought about the answer. She thought about the Meridian deal. She thought about the board. She thought about the last 3 months, the proposal documents that had appeared in a competitor's pitch deck, the scheduling conflicts that had emerged around key meetings, the partner who had quietly taken 2 conversations off the calendar without explanation. She had cataloged these things. She had noted them. She had not yet connected them. "More than one person," she said finally. He nodded. "Then we should keep looking." The car stayed, and, for reasons she couldn't fully articulate to herself, so did she. He had a daughter named Sophie, 8 years old, with her father's dark hair and what he described as her late mother's habit of asking questions that were too large for the room they were in. She came to the garage after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, sat at the card table doing homework, and occasionally handed her father tools with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it since she could walk. The garage, Victoria gradually understood, was not simply Daniel's workplace. It was the center of their life together. There was a coffee maker, because Sophie liked hot chocolate. There were 2 folding chairs, because that was enough for what they needed. Everything in the space was exactly as necessary as it needed to be, and nothing more. There was a kind of integrity to that which Victoria found, unexpectedly, difficult to look away from. Daniel Hartley had a master's degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Michigan and had spent 7 years as a lead powertrain engineer at a Tier 1 automotive supplier called Vantech Dynamics, working on next-generation hybrid engine systems. His work during that period had produced 3 significant innovations in fuel efficiency architecture, innovations that were subsequently patented not under his name, but under the name of his then supervisor, a man named Gerald Foss, who had presented Daniel's research to the company's executive team without acknowledgement, had accepted the promotion and the bonus structure that followed, and had sent Daniel a form letter thanking him for his contributions to the team. Daniel had filed a complaint. Legal had reviewed the complaint. Legal had found in favor of the company. 6 months later, Daniel's contract had not been renewed. He had spent the following year trying to re-enter the industry through legitimate channels and had discovered, in the way that these things happen when someone powerful decides to make it happen, that every door was either closed or closing. He had opened the garage the year after that. His wife, Renata, had been diagnosed 14 months later. She had died 16 months after that. Sophie had been 4 years old. Victoria didn't ask him any of this directly. It came out across the hours of that first night. She had intended to leave at 7, had been there at 11, was still there at 1 in the morning, because at some point the conversation had become the kind she didn't have very often, the kind where both people were saying things they actually meant. She sat in one of the folding chairs with a cup of coffee that was too strong and listened while Daniel worked, and the story came out in pieces, the way real stories do, not in order, not with narrative neatness, but in fragments attached to other subjects, dropped into silences and picked up again. She thought, more than once, about how rarely she found herself in a room where the other person was not performing something: authority, warmth, competence, ambition. Daniel Hartley was simply present. It was disarming in a way she hadn't been prepared for. "My father had a philosophy," she said at some point. He believed that the act of repair was a form of respect. That when you fix something instead of replacing it, you're saying it still has value. That what it was is worth returning to. She paused. He applied it to everything: cars, relationships, people. Daniel was quiet for a moment. He tightened something she couldn't name. "Mine did too," he said. Except the world kept telling him he was wrong. It was at 20 minutes past midnight that he found the second thing. He had been working through the undercarriage when he stopped, reached carefully into a recessed area behind the rear axle, and extracted a small black device roughly the size of a USB drive. He held it up under the work light and looked at it with the particular stillness of someone recognizing something they hadn't expected to see. "This is a GPS tracker," he said, "but not a consumer product." He turned it over in his fingers. "This is commercial grade, the kind used by private investigation firms and, occasionally, corporate security departments." He set it on the workbench. "It's been removed and reattached. At least twice. Based on the wear on the adhesive." He looked at her. "Someone inside your organization has been accessing this car and reporting your location." The silence in the garage was total, except for the fluorescent hum. Victoria looked at the device. She thought about the parking structure beneath her building, where only senior staff had access. She thought about her personal assistant and her security team and the 3 board members who had standing invitations to building access. She thought about the partner who had canceled the meetings. She thought about the proposal documents in the competitor's pitch, and she felt the architecture of it beginning to resolve, not clearly yet, not completely, but the shape of it. The outline. The intention behind the chaos of the last 3 months. "I need to know who makes this model," she said. "I already know," Daniel said. "I've seen it before." He didn't elaborate immediately, and she understood by his expression that what he was about to say was going to cost him something to say. The company that uses this specific tracker as part of their standard corporate package is Foss Automotive Group. The name took a second to register. Then it did. "Foss," she said. "As in Gerald Foss." "As in Gerald Foss," he confirmed. The calls from dealerships had continued throughout the week, not from Hartley Automotive, but from the 3 she had visited on Tuesday, following up, offering incentives, suggesting she come back in for another look at the new inventory. One of them had dropped the price on a demo model. Another had offered to arrange financing at a rate she hadn't asked about. The persistence felt different to her now. It felt coordinated. In the same window of time, a senior partner at Harmon Realty, a man named Robert Caldwell, who had been with the company for 6 years and had recently been passed over for a promotion to the executive committee, had called 2 board members directly, outside the normal communication channels, with what he described as concerns about Victoria's readiness for the Meridian deal. The board had scheduled an informal review. It was the kind of review that was not technically a vote but functioned like a preliminary one. It was scheduled for Thursday at 2 in the afternoon. The gala was Friday evening. Meanwhile, a rumor had begun to circulate through the specific channels where these kinds of rumors traveled fastest: the anonymous industry forums, the private message threads, the well-timed whisper at a golf lunch that Victoria Harmon had lost the thread of her company, that the Meridian deal was at risk, that Harmon Realty was entering a period of instability. The rumor was specific enough to sound credible and vague enough to be unfalsifiable. It was exactly the kind of thing that, if allowed to move unchecked for another 48 hours, would harden into received wisdom. "They're trying to manufacture a crisis," Victoria said. It was Thursday morning. She was standing in the garage again, coffee in hand, watching Daniel reassemble the engine bay with the careful precision of someone who took the integrity of the work as personally as the work itself. The car was part of it. Make me look distracted, overwhelmed, unable to handle operational details. Pair that with the board review and the deal disruption and the press whisper campaign, and it starts to look like a coherent picture. "It is a coherent picture," Daniel said without looking up. "It's been planned." He secured a bolt, set down the wrench. "The tracker means they've known your movements. The sabotage means they had access to the car, which means they had access to someone close to you." "Caldwell," she said. "I don't know that name," he said. "But the person who placed this device knew your parking access and your schedule. That's not someone peripheral." She was quiet for a moment. "I need evidence. Not inference. Evidence." He wiped his hands. "Then we get it. They took the car out that night for a test run, ostensibly to confirm the repair, practically to think. Daniel drove first, taking her through the routes and handling characteristics methodically, explaining what he had done and why, and she listened not just to the information but to the way he delivered it without performance, without the desire to impress, with the simple, clean authority of someone who understood what they were talking about at a molecular level. The engine ran. More than ran, it sounded the way her father had described it sounding in the early years, before decades of incomplete maintenance had layered a kind of reluctance into its voice. It ran the way it was supposed to run. She felt it in her chest. They were 3 miles from the garage, on a stretch of 2-lane road that ran parallel to the rail yard, when Daniel checked the rearview mirror and went quiet in a specific way. "We have company," he said. She looked. A black SUV, no front plates, running at a distance that suggested deliberate maintenance rather than coincidence. "How long?" she asked. "Since we left the garage." He didn't panic. He didn't accelerate immediately or do anything that would confirm their awareness to whoever was behind them. Instead, he made 2 ordinary turns, checking each time, and when the SUV replicated both, he said, "Okay," in a tone that was simply informational, and then he adjusted something on the center console, and the engine note deepened by a degree she could feel in the seat. "Your father kept the original performance configuration," he said. "I restored it. This car can move when it needs to." What followed was not a Hollywood chase. There were no jumps, no near misses, no screaming tires through crowded intersections. It was instead a demonstration of what a 60-year-old car, properly understood and properly returned to itself, could do in the hands of someone who knew it. A series of turns taken with geometric precision, a stretch of acceleration on a long, empty straightaway that pressed her back into the cream leather with a force that was both physical and something else, something she couldn't name but that felt like vindication. The SUV fell back. Then it fell further back. And then it was gone. She said nothing for a long moment after, watching the road ahead and feeling the engine settle back to its usual register, and what she felt was not relief exactly, but something older. The particular satisfaction of a thing performing exactly as it was built to perform, after everyone had said it couldn't. When they returned to the garage, the door had been forced. The lock was broken cleanly, professional work, not opportunistic. Inside, 2 filing cabinet drawers had been pulled open, and their contents spread across the floor. The laptop on the workbench had been moved. The desk had been searched. Daniel stood in the middle of the room and looked at the disorder with a stillness that she had come to recognize as his particular form of controlled feeling, the way he processed something that registered as significant without allowing it to become consuming. Then he looked at the far wall, at a spot near the pegboard where the paint was slightly scuffed, and she saw his expression change. "I know who sent them," he said. The mark on the wall was a partial boot print, low on the cinder block. The kind left when someone braces a foot against a wall to open a jammed cabinet. The tread pattern was distinctive, a high-end tactical boot with a specific lug pattern. Daniel had seen that pattern before. In Gerald Foss's building, on the private security team Foss Automotive Group employed, whose members wore matching operational footwear as part of their protocol. He had seen it the day he had gone to that building, years ago, to try to recover his work. The day they had escorted him out. The past was not a place Daniel Hartley spent much time. He had learned, in the years since Vantech and the patents and the contracts and Renata, that the past was a terrain you could either navigate or drown in, and he had chosen navigation, but there were facts about it that remained relevant. Gerald Foss had not simply stolen Daniel's research. He had built a corporate architecture around it. Vantech Dynamics had been acquired 3 years after Daniel's departure by Foss Automotive Group, a holding company Foss had established using the capital generated by the patents he had taken in Daniel's name. Foss Automotive had then expanded aggressively into dealership ownership, buying up independent service shops across the Midwest and consolidating them under a single network that specialized in, among other things, luxury and classic vehicle servicing. The network had 11 locations in Chicago alone. 3 of them were the dealerships Victoria had visited on Tuesday. All 3 had told her to buy a new car. The business model, as Daniel had pieced it together over years of quiet observation, was elegant in its cynicism. The dealerships did not simply sell cars. They managed a territory. Independent repair shops in their coverage area found their parts supply chains disrupted, their certifications challenged, their customer reviews mysteriously flagged on platforms they had no power to correct. Vehicles that came in for complex repairs received assessments that exaggerated the difficulty and cost of the work, steering owners toward replacement purchases. Warranty claims were processed through a network of preferred partners who returned portions of the settlement to the dealership. The older and rarer the vehicle, the more valuable the conversion. Convincing someone to abandon a fixable classic meant extracting not just one purchase, but an ongoing service relationship with a new vehicle that the network controlled from bumper to bumper. It was not illegal in any single transaction. Aggregated across thousands of customers over 5 years, it constituted systematic fraud on a scale that would take considerable documentation to establish. Victoria had been a target because of her influence, her visibility, and her upcoming deal. If the Meridian partnership succeeded, Harmon Realty would become the development anchor for 3 major urban renewal projects in districts where Foss Automotive had significant real estate holdings. A competing developer, one with connections to Foss, had been positioning for those contracts for 18 months. Caldwell, Victoria's own senior partner, had apparently been in contact with Foss's representatives for at least 6 weeks. The sabotage of the car had been, in this context, a pressure tactic. Undermine her composure, her credibility, and her time management in the most personal way possible, in the worst possible week, and watch the weight of it bend her toward a mistake. They spent most of Thursday night building the file. Daniel had kept records not of everything, but of what he had documented in the years since leaving the industry, parts that had passed through his garage bearing serial numbers inconsistent with their claimed histories, repair orders from vehicles that had previously been assessed by the Foss network, and whose documented findings contradicted what the physical evidence showed. The tracker device with its model number and serial traced to a Foss corporate procurement order. Photographs he had taken of the sabotaged engine component before the repair, documentation of the tool marks, and the specific nature of the alteration. Victoria added what she had: the financial records that pointed to Caldwell, the communications metadata that showed the timing of the board outreach relative to the Meridian deal's timeline, and the pattern of coordinated pressure from the dealerships, the follow-up calls, the incentive offers, the timing that correlated too precisely with the board review to be coincidental. Together, it was not a neat package, but it was sufficient. It was the kind of evidence that, in the right room, with the right presentation, would make denial not only implausible, but professionally fatal. Getting the physical evidence required one more step. There was a storage facility associated with the Foss Network's central service operation, a distribution warehouse on the southwest side that handled parts inventory and, Daniel believed, the documentation associated with warranty manipulation. He had a contact there, a former colleague who had stayed in the industry and who had, over the years, provided Daniel with occasional information in the form of things left accidentally where they could be found. The contact had confirmed, without being directly asked, that current model warranty claim files from the past 18 months were kept in a specific room in that facility. The shift rotation had a gap. The door at the south loading bay was not on the camera circuit. They went in at 2 in the morning. It was not dramatic in the way that implied recklessness. It was carefully timed and carefully executed, moving through a loading area and into a corridor that smelled like industrial shelving and printer toner. Victoria kept watch at one end while Daniel worked at the other, moving through the file room with a methodical speed that suggested he had visualized this before doing it. The cameras were positioned with blind spots that a person who had worked in this kind of facility would know to expect. They had perhaps 20 minutes. They were at 16 minutes when a door opened at the far end of the corridor. A security officer, early on his rounds. Victoria was in his sightline before Daniel was. She stood, very still. The officer slowed. The moment expanded into something that felt much longer than it was. "Go," Daniel said from behind her, quietly. Not to the officer, to her. "Take the files. Go out the way we came." And before she could respond to the meaning of what he was telling her, he had stepped forward into the officer's view and away from her, drawing attention with the simple physics of movement, giving her the route she needed, and no longer using it himself. She took the files. She went. She did not look back. Though every part of her wanted to, because she understood that looking back was exactly the kind of hesitation that would undo what he had just given her. The board meeting was at 2 on Thursday afternoon. Victoria arrived at 1:58. She had not slept. She was wearing the same charcoal gray she always wore, and she carried a tablet and a printed folder, and she walked to the head of the conference table with the particular bearing of someone who has decided, in a very final way, that retreat is not among her options. The 7 board members present had expected a defensive posture, some degree of explanation, perhaps some conciliation, the careful management of optics that characterized most leadership reviews. What they got was the opposite. She presented for 38 minutes without interruption. The evidence was not emotional. It was structural. The timeline, the communications, the financial flows, the parts documentation from the Foss network that showed systematic warranty manipulation across hundreds of vehicles, the tracker, serial number, traced to a Foss corporate security procurement order, the engine sabotage documentation with its technical analysis, and the call records linking Robert Caldwell to the Foss organization going back to the previous quarter. She presented these things with the same flat precision she used in investment committee meetings, treating the corruption of her own company as a problem to be understood and resolved rather than a wound to be displayed. She did not perform outrage. She did not ask for sympathy. She laid out what had happened and what it meant and what she intended to do about it, and she let the evidence carry the argument. Robert Caldwell was not present. He had been told the meeting was for board members only. He learned what had happened when the meeting ended. 2 board members had been leaning toward the informal vote that would have initiated a leadership review. By the time Victoria finished, neither of them said a word about it. One of them, Eleanor Park, who had been on the board since the company's 2nd year and who had, On 2 previous occasions, having been the vote that kept Victoria in her chair during difficult periods, said simply, "Send this to legal and to the press contact." In that order, it was the closest thing to a standing ovation the room was capable of producing. The story broke on Friday morning, not through a single outlet but through several simultaneously: the financial press, a technology news site, and a local television station that had been investigating Foss Automotive Group's warranty practices independently for months, and had been waiting for corroborating documentation. The warehouse files gave them what they needed. The reaction was fast and, by the end of the business day, severe. 3 of the Foss Network's dealerships announced closures. 2 financial partners suspended their agreements. The board of Foss Automotive Group requested Gerald Foss's resignation pending an internal review. By Friday evening, when the Meridian Gala proceeded as scheduled, at the venue, with the signing the story had become, in the careful language of financial journalism, a significant corporate governance event. People at the gala mentioned it to Victoria, with expressions that mixed admiration and calculation in proportions she had long ago learned to read accurately. She accepted both without comment. Robert Caldwell was placed on administrative leave, pending the completion of a legal review. He did not contest it. Daniel Hartley was released from police custody at noon on Friday, after it became evident to the officers involved that the man they were holding had not broken into the warehouse in any meaningful sense. The door had been unlocked. No property had been taken without authorization from someone with access rights, and the documentation he had allegedly removed was now at the center of a multi-agency investigation that made his detention both awkward and counterproductive. He called Sophie from the station. She had been staying with a neighbor. He told her he would be home by dinner and that he was fine and that she should finish her homework. Victoria did not go to the gala in her father's car. She had the sedan returned to the garage after the evidence was secured, because it was the right place for it during what remained an unsettled situation, and she went to the gala in a hired car like she had every other night that week. She signed the agreement. She shook the hands. She answered the questions. She did all the things she was supposed to do, and she did them well, because she was very good at her job and had not stopped being so for a single moment of the entire extraordinary week. But at 10:15, when the event wound down and the last press photograph was taken and her assistant was beginning to gather materials, she told Marcus she would find her own way home. She drove to the garage. It was dark. The door was locked. There was a note taped to it. In handwriting she recognized by now Daniel's, which was precise and slightly formal in the way of someone who had been educated by people who cared about handwriting. The note said, "Sophie has a school event Saturday morning. We'll be back by noon. The car is ready." She stood in front of that note for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she unlocked the side door with the spare key he had left beneath the note, and she sat in the car, in the dark garage, with no particular destination in mind, and allowed herself to feel, quietly and without witness, the full weight of the week she had just survived. She thought about her father. She thought about what it meant to build something, really build it, not acquire it, not leverage it into being, but construct it by hand from an understanding of how its parts related to each other. She thought about what he had said to her once, when she was a teenager, and had asked him why he spent so many hours in the garage when he could be doing other things. He had said, "Because most of the things that matter can be saved if you're willing to do the work of understanding them." She had been 17 and had found this answer insufficiently practical. She was 41 now and found it the most practical thing she had ever heard. She found Daniel 3 weeks later, not in Chicago, but in a small town in southern Wisconsin called Mineral Point, where he had relocated temporarily to fulfill a restoration commitment for a collector who owned a 1959 Alfa Romeo Giulietta that needed work he could only do properly with access to a larger lift. She drove the Mercedes. She drove it on the county roads because those were the roads it was built for, and because it was, as Daniel had returned it to being, an extraordinary machine when treated as one. Sophie was in the back seat, reading a book about migratory birds, which she had apparently developed an interest in during the 3 weeks since the events in Chicago, and which she discussed with considerable authority whenever the subject arose, which was frequently. They had met briefly the previous week, in the garage, when Victoria had returned the coffee maker she had accidentally taken home, not accidentally, though she had said accidentally, and Sophie had looked at her with the evaluating gaze of an 8-year-old who has learned to take nothing on faith and had eventually decided, based on criteria Victoria didn't fully understand but respected, that she was acceptable company. The lift in the temporary workshop was occupied by the Julietta when Victoria arrived. Daniel was underneath it and did not hear her come in. She waited until he rolled out from under the car, saw her, and did the thing he did when something surprised him, a brief stillness, like a system recalibrating before getting to his feet and wiping his hands on the rag he kept folded through his belt loop. She told him what she wanted. She had been thinking about it for 3 weeks, which for Victoria meant she had been planning it, running projections, consulting lawyers, identifying locations, and building the financial model before she had decided to say anything out loud. She wanted to establish a vehicle restoration center. Not a dealership. Not a corporate service center. Something different. A facility dedicated to the restoration of older vehicles, staffed by skilled independent mechanics, with an attached training program for young technicians who wanted to learn the work properly. The business model was not charity. She had run the numbers, and the market for quality vintage restoration was both real and underserved, particularly at the luxury end. But the point was not simply the margin. The point was the counterargument. The living, operational, economically viable counterargument to the Foss model. Proof that honesty could be made to pay. Daniel said no. He said it without hostility or drama, the same way he said most things. He said he had been in the world she was describing, or a version of it, and the cost of it was something he had already paid and had no interest in paying again. He said Sophie was doing well. He said the garage was enough. His refusal was not defensive. It was considered, delivered with the same weight he gave every decision, the quiet sureness of a man who had learned through significant pain to know exactly what he was and was not willing to risk. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Then we build a different one." He was quiet. Outside, through the open workshop door, the Wisconsin afternoon was doing what Wisconsin afternoons did in early autumn light, coming in at an angle that made everything look like it was in the last few minutes of something, golden and specific and briefly perfect. Sophie had come to the doorway at some point and was leaning against the frame, eating an apple, watching them with the characteristic attention of someone for whom the world was a continuous source of data worth collecting. "Different how?" he said finally. "Different in every way that matters," she said. "No corporate structure above the floor. No performance metrics that contradict the actual work. No Gerald Fosses." She paused. "You design it. I fund it. We share everything except the decisions about what gets fixed and how. Those are yours." The silence ran long enough that Sophie finished her apple and tossed the core cleanly into a waste bin across the room. Daniel watched her do it. Then he looked back at Victoria. "You drive that car here?" he said. "Yes." "How did she run?" Victoria thought about it, about the county roads and the angle of the light and the way the engine had felt beneath her, restored, returned itself again. Every part working in relation to every other part the way it was designed to, nothing forced, nothing compensating for something broken elsewhere. "Like she was supposed to," she said. He nodded. And that was, for the moment, enough. The center opened 5 months later, in a converted warehouse space in a neighborhood on Chicago's west side that was 2 blocks from the original Hartley Automotive Garage. It was called simply Hartley and Harmon Restoration. The sign was not hand-painted, but it was close. Daniel had approved one version of the lettering and rejected 2 others on grounds he explained at length, in terms of legibility and proportion, and the final version was the kind of saw. The facility had 6 bays, a parts library, a documentation archive of restoration history going back 30 years compiled by Daniel over the course of a working life, and a training program for 6 apprentices per year, selected through a partnership with 3 community colleges and a vocational school on the south side. In the first year, they turned away more work than they accepted. because Daniel would not expand faster than he could maintain the quality of the work. Victoria had agreed with this policy. It had surprised him slightly that she had. The garage on Kedzie was still open. Daniel kept it open 2 days a week, by appointment only. For the cases that came directly to him by word of mouth, the difficult ones, the old ones, the vehicles that everyone else had said couldn't be saved, he charged fairly, and he charged less when the customer needed him to, and he never told anyone to buy a new car when what they actually needed was someone willing to understand what they already had. Sophie came on Saturdays. She had developed, in the month since everything happened, a specific interest in electrical systems, which she studied with the same methodical attention she brought to migratory birds, and which Daniel encouraged without making too much of it, because that was how he had always encouraged things, by making space, not noise. Foss Automotive Group filed for bankruptcy protection 11 months after the disclosure. Gerald Foss resigned, then reversed the resignation under legal advice, then resigned again when it became clear that the legal advice had been optimistic. The warranty fraud settlement covered 212 former customers across 6 states. The dealerships in the Foss network that had told Victoria Harmon to buy a new car were among the first to be liquidated in the proceedings. The consultant who had laughed at her found work at a smaller dealership in a different city. He did not laugh at clients about their old cars again. At least, not in the first year. The 1968 Mercedes-Benz 280 SE sat in Bay, one of the Hartley and Harmon facility, occasionally, and at Victoria's invitation, when it needed anything. Mostly it didn't. Mostly it ran the way it had been designed to run, the way her father had first heard it run on a winter afternoon in a used lot in Evanston, and decided, against all practical advice, that it was worth the work of returning to itself. She drove it to the signing of the second Meridian project and to the launch of the training program's first cohort. And on Sunday mornings, when the lake road was clear and the light came in the right way, and there was no particular destination, only the drive, she drove it to the garage in Mineral Point once more, the following spring, to pick up Sophie for a school event that Daniel had a conflict attending, and Sophie had climbed into the back seat and looked at the interior with the considered approval of someone who understood, at a level she couldn't yet fully articulate, what the car represented. Victoria had watched her in the rearview mirror and had not said anything, because nothing needed to be said. Some things are worth the work of saving. Some people will tell you otherwise, will hand back your keys and smile, and point you toward something newer, shinier, easier to sell. They are not wrong that replacement is faster. They are wrong that it is better. The difference between those two positions is the difference between a system that extracts and a person who understands. Victoria Harmon had spent her career building things, and she had spent the worst week of that career being reminded of why it mattered, not by someone powerful, not by someone celebrated, but by a man in a gray thermal shirt in a garage that smelled like cedar and solvent, who had looked at a dying engine and asked the right question instead of the convenient one. Some people replace what's broken. Others fight to understand it.